Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the undefeated guardian. Silence before the storm. The chains bit into his wrists. February 1597. Seoul's winter wind carried the smell of snow and something far colder. Betrayal. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the man who had never lost a single naval battle, who had shattered Japanese fleets time and again, now stumbled through the capital's frozen streets in iron shackles. Guards flanked him on both sides. Citizens watched in silence as the kingdom's greatest defender was dragged toward prison like a common criminal. His crime? Refusing to obey orders based on lies. They would torture him soon. Whips, fire, the cudgel breaking bones, the classic Korean technique of shattering legs between wooden planks. King Seonjo wanted him dead. The court officials who had always envied his victories were finally getting their revenge. Yi had defeated the Japanese Navy 17 times. Now his own government would attempt what the enemy could not. His destruction. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story doesn't begin in chains. It doesn't even begin with victory. It begins with a choice. Flash forward 1 year and 10 months. December 16, 1598. Dawn hasn't broken yet. The Myeongnyang Strait churns with violence. Cannon fire illuminates the darkness in brief, hellish bursts. The smell of gunpowder mingles with salt spray and blood. Admiral Yi Sun-sin stands on the deck of his flagship, directing the final battle of a 7-year war. Around him, hundreds of ships clash in the narrow waters. Japanese vessels burn. Korean and Ming cannons roar. The admiral is 53 years old. His hair is grey. His body bears the scars of battles both external and internal. He has won 23 naval engagements, not one defeat, not a single loss in his entire military career, against odds that military historians would later call impossible. This morning, near his left armpit, a stray arquebus bullet will find him. But before that bullet, before those chains, before the glory and the betrayal and the miracle of 13 ships facing 300, we must understand where legends come from. They come from hunger, forged in hardship. April 28, 1545. Gyeongcheon-dong, Hansong, the capital city that would one day be called Seoul. Yi Sun-sin was born into a Yangban family, Korea's noble class. This sounds impressive until you understand that his Yangban status came with poverty instead of power. His grandfather, Yi Baek-nok, had abandoned political life when the court executed reformer Jo Gwang-jo during the Third Literati Purge of 1519. Sometimes principles cost more than money. Yi's grandfather chose exile over complicity. The family moved to a village near where Jo was buried, a silent protest that condemned them to generations of poverty. Yi's father, Yi Jong, inherited his father's disillusionment. He refused to enter government service, despite expectations. The Yi family possessed the blood of nobility, but lived with the struggles of commoners. Young Yi Sun-sin grew up knowing that honor and survival were often enemies. Due to their poverty, the family moved to Asan in Chungcheongnam-do province, where Yi's mother had relatives. This is where Yi would spend his formative years, not in palaces or academies, but in a town that smelled of rice paddies and hard work. He learned early that the world owed him nothing, that food required labor, that respect required sacrifice. The records don't waste space on his childhood games or daily routines. History doesn't care about those things. What matters is what those hungry years forged inside him. By the time Yi was 16, he had learned that survival itself was a battle. He would need to learn greater battles soon. In Asan, Yi met someone who would change the trajectory of his life. Ryu Seong-ryong, a brilliant scholar 3 years his senior. The sources suggest they met when Yi was 22. They lived as neighbors in Gyeongcheon-dong when Yi returned from Asan. Ryu would later become chief state counselor, one of the most powerful positions in Joseon. More importantly, during the Japanese invasions, Ryu would serve as Dochaichalsa, supreme commander of military affairs. This friendship would save Yi's life multiple times. It would also force Ryu to make impossible choices between friendship and politics. We'll return to that betrayal later. For now, know this. Yi's childhood shaped a man who trusted principles over power, who believed in preparation over prayer, who would rather die with honor than live with compromise. These qualities would make him a legend. They would also make him enemies. August 1572. Yi Sun-sin was 28 years old. Most military officers began their careers in their early 20s. Yi was starting late, but he had decided he would serve his country through military strength, not scholarly politics. He applied for the military officer examination. The test included archery. It included strategy. It included cavalry skills. During the cavalry portion, Yi's horse spooked. He fell. Hard. The sound of his leg breaking echoed across the training grounds. Candidates nearby winced. Officers shook their heads. The examination was over. A broken leg meant disqualification. Yi Sun-sin looked down at his shattered leg. The bone jutted wrong beneath the skin. Pain radiated up his thigh in white-hot waves. Around him, other candidates continued their tests, the sound of hoofbeats, the shouts of instructors, the creaking of leather saddles. He reached for a willow branch near the training field. What happened next would become legendary. Yi fashioned a makeshift splint from the willow, binding it tight against his broken leg with strips of cloth. His hands shook. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool weather. Every movement sent agony lancing through his body. He gritted his teeth until his jaw ached. Then he mounted his horse and completed the examination. Imagine that. A broken leg, bones, grinding, and Yi finished the cavalry test. The judges stared in disbelief. This level of determination, this absolute refusal to accept defeat, would define every battle Yi would ever fight. He didn't pass that year. The injury was too severe. But 4 years later, in February 1576, at the impossibly late age of 32, Yi Sun-sin passed the military examination. He began his career at the absolute bottom, a defense soldier on the northern frontier, the lowest rank, the hardest posting. Most nobles would have balked. Yi simply served. Over the next 15 years, he would learn what military life actually meant. The cold nights on watch, the weight of responsibility, the corrupted officers who stole from their own men, the political games that put personal advancement above national defense. Yi refused to play those games. This rigid adherence to principles would cause him suffering. Again and again, superiors who profited from corruption accused him of insubordination. His first major persecution came early. General Yi Il, who would later catastrophically fail to defend against the Japanese invasion at the Battle of Sangju, led a conspiracy against Yi. The charge was desertion during battle, completely false. Yi was stripped of his rank, imprisoned, tortured. Released, he fought as a common soldier, climbed through the ranks again, slowly, painfully, proving himself with each step. He was appointed magistrate of a small county, then commander of a training center in Seoul, then transferred to the northern frontier again. Every appointment brought new enemies, men who resented his competence, officers threatened by his integrity, politicians who couldn't bribe or control him. But some people saw Yi's true worth. In February 1591, at age 46, Yi Sun-sin was appointed commander of the Left Jola Naval District, based at Yosu on Korea's southern coast. It was a defensive posting, quiet, the kind of assignment given to competent officers you wanted out of the way in the capital. The seas had been peaceful for decades. Japanese piracy had diminished. War seemed unlikely. Yi arrived at Yosu and found 24 Panoxion warships and 15 smaller vessels anchored in the bay. A modest fleet, adequate for peacetime patrols, laughable for actual war. Yi Sun-sin did what he always did. He studied, he prepared, he anticipated, and what he saw terrified him. The call to the sea. The archives in Yosu held documents that most commanders never bothered to read. Dusty scrolls, old battle reports, designs for ships long forgotten. Yi read everything. One document made him stop. Dated 1413, it described a ship called a Guision, a turtle ship. The first generation of armored warships. These vessels had been built during King Hyunjong's reign to combat Manchurian pirates. The design was revolutionary. A covered deck to prevent boarding, multiple gun ports for cannons, a reinforced hull strong enough to ram enemy vessels. Turtle ships had fallen out of use during the long peace. Korea's naval preparedness had declined. Why maintain expensive warships when there was no threat? Yi looked at the old designs. Then he looked east, toward Japan. Political instability in Japan had ended. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had united the warring daimyos under his rule. Now Hideyoshi needed to keep his ambitious generals occupied. He needed to satisfy the samurai class hungry for glory and plunder. He needed to prove his power. Hideyoshi's ambition was simple: conquer China. But to reach China, he had to go through Korea. Yi saw this clearly. Others did not, or did not care. The Joseon court was consumed with factional politics. Ministers maneuvered against each other. The king worried about internal threats, not external invasion. Intelligence reports about Japanese military buildup were ignored or dismissed. But Yi's friend, Ryu Seong-ryong, believed him. Together, they began preparing for a war that everyone else thought impossible. Yi called together his subordinates. Among them was Na Dae-yong, a skilled shipwright. Yi spread the turtle ship designs before them. "We need these," Yi said simply. "The Japanese are coming." Construction began in 1591. A turtle ship wasn't a small project. Each vessel required massive amounts of timber, heavy pine planks for the hull, sturdy oak for the structural supports. The ships would measure between 100 and 120 feet in length, with a beam of roughly 30 feet. Multiple decks separated the rowing compartments from the combat areas, allowing crews to operate independently. 10 to 24 oars per side provided maneuverability, but the revolutionary feature was the covered deck. Traditional warships had open decks. This allowed sailors to move freely, to fire arrows, to prepare for boarding actions. But it also left crews vulnerable. Japanese tactics relied heavily on boarding, grabbing hooks, grappling hooks, melee combat, samurai swords against sailors. The Japanese were masters of ship-to-ship fighting. The turtle ship changed everything. The design called for a rounded roof covering the entire upper deck. This roof would be constructed from heavy timber planks. Sources debate whether it was 4 inches thick or thicker. Some historical records suggest hexagonal iron plates covered portions of the deck, though this remains disputed. What's certain is that iron spikes protruded from the entire roof surface. Imagine approaching this vessel to board it. You've thrown your grappling hooks. Your samurai are ready to leap across and engage in close combat. Your greatest strength. You jump onto the enemy deck and immediately your feet are pierced by iron spikes. You cannot stand. You cannot fight. You fall, impaled. Admiral Yi often covered these spikes with rice straw mats to disguise them, luring the Japanese into the trap. The turtle ship's offensive armaments were equally impressive. Gun ports lined the sides, between 11 and 24 positions, depending on the vessel. These ports could be opened or closed quickly. The Koreans had developed superior cannon technology, with effective ranges between 300 and 500 meters. 4 types of cannon were deployed. The Chon cannon fired the heaviest rounds. The Chi provided medium-range suppression. The Hyun offered rapid fire support. The Hwang delivered precision strikes at distance. Each cannon's useful life was between 100 and 200 rounds. Then the barrel degraded too much for safe firing. This meant constant maintenance, constant recasting of weapons, constant management of resources. At the bow, the turtle ship featured its most iconic element, a dragon's head. This wasn't mere decoration. The dragon head served multiple tactical purposes. Some versions contained a cannon inside the mouth. The ship could fire directly forward while ramming. Other versions included a mechanism to emit dense, sulfurous smoke. Sulfur and saltpeter mixed in the bowels of the ship, then released through the dragon's mouth. This toxic smoke obscured vision, interfered with enemy coordination, and added psychological terror to the turtle ship's approach. The entire crew, between 50 and 70 oarsmen, 50 to 60 marines, and the command staff, worked in darkness inside the vessel. Narrow viewing slits and gun ports provided limited vision. Commanders relied on sound, on the rhythm of drums, on practiced coordination developed through relentless training. Compare this to Japanese warships of the period. Japanese vessels prioritized speed and mobility for their boarding tactics. Their warships averaged about 50 feet in length, with a beam of 20 feet. giving them a length-to-width ratio of roughly 2.5 to 1. The turtle ships ratio was closer to 4 to 1, providing much better stability and cannon platform characteristics. Japanese ships were constructed from Japanese cedar, which was lighter but weaker than Korean pine. They could carry few cannons, maybe 1 or 2 per vessel. Their armaments focused on arquebuses and melee weapons. They relied on the samurai's exceptional hand-to-hand combat skills. Against open-deck Korean ships, these tactics worked. Against a turtle ship, the Japanese had no counter-strategy. Through 1591 and early 1592, Yi pushed his men relentlessly. Training exercises, cannon drills, formation practice. He stockpiled gunpowder, ammunition, and provisions. He studied coastal geography, tidal patterns, wind conditions. He established signal systems and supply networks. His officers in Jeolla province followed his lead. Commander Yi Ok-gi, who commanded the right Jeolla Navy, also prepared diligently. Meanwhile, in Gyeongsang province, Commander Won Gyun did very little. Won Gyun would become Yi's bitter rival, and the man whose incompetence would nearly doom Korea. On April 12, 1592, Yi Sun-sin's diary records that Na Dae-yong completed the first modern turtle ship. They test-fired the cannons. Everything functioned perfectly. One day later, April 13, 1592, the Japanese invasion began. The storm breaks. The Japanese called it Seikanron, the theory of conquering Korea. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's plan was straightforward. Use Korea as a land bridge to invade Ming China. The Korean peninsula would provide staging grounds, supply bases, and a buffer zone for the ultimate prize. Hideyoshi assembled an invasion force of approximately 160,000 troops, the largest amphibious assault in East Asian history to that point. Over 1,700 ships carried samurai, ashigaru foot soldiers, and supplies across the strait to Busan. On April 13, 1592, the first wave landed. The Korean commanders at Busan and Dadaijin were overwhelmed immediately. Japanese forces wielded thousands of arquebuses, firearms that Joseon troops largely lacked in equivalent numbers. The samurai were battle-hardened from decades of civil war. They moved with terrifying efficiency. Busan fell on the first day. The Japanese advanced north with shocking speed. Korean ground forces, unprepared and poorly coordinated, collapsed before the onslaught. The fortress at Sangju fell. Choryang Pass, a critical defensive position, was abandoned. On May 2, 1592, just 19 days after the invasion began, Japanese forces captured Seoul. King Seonjo fled. The royal court evacuated north toward Pyongyang in chaos. Citizens, furious at their king's abandonment, set fire to Gyeongbokgung Palace. Flames consumed centuries of history. The Japanese marched through the burning capital virtually unopposed. By June, Japanese forces had pushed as far north as Pyongyang. It seemed that Korea would fall completely within months. Hideyoshi's plan was working. The path to China lay open, except for one thing: the sea. While Korean ground forces crumbled, Admiral Yi Sun-sin's fleet remained undefeated. On May 7, 1592, Yi had sailed from Yosu with his Jeolla fleet. He rendezvoused with Yi Ok-gi's forces and with Won Gyung's Gyeongsang province fleet. Together, they searched for the Japanese navy. June 16, 1592. Okpo Harbor. Yi's scouts reported enemy ships anchored in the harbor. The Japanese were pillaging a Korean village, loading plunder onto their vessels. When Yi's combined fleet of 91 ships appeared on the horizon, confusion erupted among the Japanese. Some tried to return to their ships. Others fled into the hills. The Korean fleet formed a battle line and advanced. Yi had trained his crews in ranged combat. Korean Panoxion warships carried superior cannons, with longer effective ranges than anything the Japanese possessed. The Koreans didn't need to close for boarding. They could devastate enemy vessels from a distance that kept them relatively safe from Japanese arquebuses. The first turtle ship entered combat at Okpo. Its appearance shocked the Japanese. This armored beast advanced directly toward their ships, ignoring arrows and arquebus. Fire. Cannons roared from multiple ports. The dragon's head spewed smoke. Japanese sailors had never seen anything like it. 26 Japanese ships burned that day. The Koreans suffered 3 casualties total. 0 ships lost. The next day, Yi's fleet engaged Japanese forces at Happo and Jeokjinpo, destroying an additional 20 ships. In 3 battles over 24 hours, Yi had sunk 46 Japanese vessels without losing a single Korean ship. This was the first Korean victory of the war. News reached King Seonjo in his northern exile. For the first time since the invasion began, Koreans had reason to hope. The nation had a defender. Yi didn't rest. Through June, July, and into August, his fleet hunted Japanese ships along the southern coast. Dangpo, Danghangpo. Each engagement ended in Korean victory. The turtle ships proved unstoppable. Japanese commanders grew wary of engaging Yi's forces directly. But Yi's greatest battle, and one of the greatest naval engagements in human history, was approaching. The Crane takes flight, August 14, 1592, July 8 by the lunar calendar. Near Hansando Island, Admiral Wakizaka Yasuharu commanded 73 Japanese warships. He was bold, ambitious, and confident in his force's abilities. The Japanese had dominated land combat. Why would sea battles differ? Wakizaka's fleet entered Myeongnyang, a narrow strait near Jeoje Island. His ships were large and numerous. His samurai were eager for combat. Intelligence suggested Korean naval forces were in the area, but the Japanese had numbers on their side. Yi Sun-sin had a different plan. His combined fleet, now strengthened to 56 warships through coordination with Yi Eokgi and Wongyun, waited beyond the strait in the open waters near Hansando Island. But Yi didn't advance directly. Instead, he sent 5 to 6 ships into Myeongnyang as bait. The small Korean squadron appeared at the strait's entrance. The Japanese spotted them immediately. Wakizaka saw his opportunity. Outnumber these few ships, destroy them, then hunt down the main Korean force. He gave the order to attack. The Japanese fleet surged forward. Their ships were fast, their captains experienced. They pursued the small Korean force aggressively. The Korean squadron turned and fled, not in panic, in perfect coordination. They led the Japanese exactly where Yi wanted them, out into open water, away from the narrow strait where Japanese ships could find refuge on nearby islands, away from shallow waters where damaged vessels could beach and crews could escape, out into the deep where there was nowhere to run. The Japanese realized the trap too late. As Wakizaka's fleet emerged into the open sea off Hansando Island, they suddenly faced the entire Korean fleet arranged in formation. Before the Japanese could react, Yi gave the order. Hakik-jin, the crane wing formation. This tactic was ancient, dating back to Sun Tzu's Art of War. On land it was well known. A semicircular encirclement, allowing simultaneous attacks from multiple angles. But naval commanders rarely attempted it. The coordination required at sea, with waves and winds, and the challenge of ship positioning, made it enormously difficult. Yi's months of drilling made it possible. The Korean ships spread into a crescent formation, like a crane spreading its wings. The Japanese fleet found itself surrounded on 3 sides. Ships that had been hidden behind Hansando Island now emerged to complete the encirclement. The turtle ships charged into the center of the Japanese formation, their armored hulls absorbing fire, while their cannons devastated everything in range. What followed was slaughter, not battle. Korean ships at every point of the crane wing opened fire simultaneously. Cannons boomed from 40 directions at once. Japanese vessels, designed for boarding combat, had no response. They couldn't close the distance. Korean ships maintained formation and range perfectly. They couldn't escape. The encirclement was complete. They couldn't outgun the Koreans. The firepower disparity was too extreme. Japanese ships burned. Captains tried to organize counterattacks, but the formation made coordination impossible. Some vessels attempted to break through the Korean line. The turtle ships blocked them, ramming and blasting at point-blank range. The iron spikes deterred boarding attempts. The smoke from the dragonheads obscured vision and choked Japanese sailors. The battle lasted hours. When it ended, the waters off Hansando Island floated with wreckage. Sources vary on exact numbers, but the conservative estimates are devastating enough. 47 Japanese ships sunk, 12 captured. Nearly 60 vessels destroyed out of 73. Thousands of Japanese sailors and marines drowned or burned. Those who survived had no ships to return in. Korean losses? Minimal. Some sources report no ships lost. Minor casualties among the crews. Yi Sun-sin achieved one of the most lopsided naval victories in recorded history. Admiral George Alexander Ballard of the British Royal Navy would later write about Yi's achievement. This was the great Korean admiral's crowning exploit. In the short space of 9 weeks, he had achieved a series of successes unsurpassed in the whole annals of maritime war, destroying the enemy's battle fleets, cutting his lines of communication, sweeping up his convoys, imperiling the situation of his victorious armies in the field, and bringing his ambitious schemes to utter ruin. Not even Nelson, Blake, or Jean Bart could have done more than this scarcely known representative of a small and cruelly oppressed nation. The Battle of Hansando joined the ranks of history's greatest naval engagements, alongside the Battle of Salamis, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the Battle of Trafalgar. For Korea, the victory meant salvation. The Japanese army, which had advanced all the way to Pyongyang, suddenly found itself cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Konishi Yukinaga's forces, which had conquered the north, now sat isolated in Pyongyang Castle. They couldn't advance further without naval support. They couldn't receive additional troops. Food supplies dwindled. The entire Japanese strategy, land conquest supported by sea control, collapsed because Yi Sun-sin controlled the seas. The tide of war was turning. But Yi's enemies weren't only across the water. Chains and betrayal. Success breeds resentment. Yi's victories shone too brightly. They made other commanders look incompetent by comparison. They challenged the corrupt power structures that many officials depended on. They proved that competence and integrity could triumph, and that terrified those who lacked both qualities. Won Gyun hated Admiral Yi. Won Gyun had been commander of the Right Gyeongsang Navy since 1591. When the war began, Won's fleet achieved little. While Yi's forces scored victory after victory, Won's record remained mediocre. Yi received promotions and honors. Won received quiet disappointment from the court. Some of this was Won's own fault. He had failed to prepare adequately, hadn't trained his crews rigorously, and lacked Yi's tactical brilliance. But Won blamed Yi for his own failures. Jealousy festered into hatred. In August 1593, Yi was appointed Supreme Commander of the Three Provinces' naval forces, essentially Commander-in-Chief of Korea's entire navy. The position recognized his unmatched success. It also made him Won Gyun's superior. Won began plotting. Through 1595 and 1596, the war entered a stalemate phase. Peace negotiations began between Korea, China, and Japan. But the negotiations were fragile. Japanese delegates demanded concessions that Korea couldn't grant. Hideyoshi's ambitions hadn't diminished. He was merely reorganizing for a second invasion. During this period, a Japanese spy infiltrated Korean command structures. His name was Yoshira. He presented himself as a defector, a double agent willing to provide intelligence about Japanese military plans. He approached Joseon General Kim Gyeong-seo with detailed information about the movements of Japanese General Kato Kiyomasa. Yoshira claimed that Kato would lead a major naval attack at a specific time and place. All Korea needed to do was position its naval forces for an ambush. Easy victory. The Japanese fleet would be destroyed. It was too convenient, too perfect. Admiral Yi Sun-sin smelled deception. Years of study had taught him how intelligence worked. Real military intelligence was fragmentary, inconsistent, requiring verification from multiple sources. This information was too precise, too specific, too obviously designed to provoke a response. Yi believed Yoshira was feeding false intelligence to lure Korean naval forces into a trap. When General Kim forwarded this intelligence to Yi with orders to stage an ambush, Yi refused. He sent a response explaining his reasoning. The intelligence appeared fabricated to draw Korean ships away from their defensive positions. Moving the fleet based on unverified information would leave Korean waters vulnerable to actual Japanese attacks elsewhere. His analysis was correct. Later events would prove Yoshiro was indeed a Japanese agent, feeding false intelligence. But Wang Gyung saw an opportunity. One reported to the royal court that Admiral Yi had refused direct orders to attack the enemy. This wasn't presented as reasonable caution. One framed it as cowardice, or worse, disloyalty. Perhaps Yi was secretly working with the Japanese. Perhaps the undefeated admiral was actually a traitor. The accusations reached King Seonjo during a period of intense political paranoia. The king had fled his capital, had seen his kingdom nearly destroyed, and now suspected conspiracies everywhere. Yi's refusal to follow orders, however justified, looked suspicious. In early February 1597, royal guards arrived in Hansando. They placed Admiral Yi Sun-sin under arrest. The guards chained his wrists and ankles. They marched him north towards Seoul. Citizens along the route watched in confusion and horror. Some wept openly. Yi Sun-sin, the man who had saved Korea, who had won every battle, who had given them hope when all seemed lost, was being treated like a criminal. In Seoul, they brought Yi before the court for interrogation. King Seonjo wanted a confession. Admit to cowardice, admit to conspiracy, admit to something that would justify this arrest and remove a man the king had grown to fear and resent. Yi refused to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. So, they tortured him. The methods were methodical and brutal. Whipping first, leather straps that tore skin and left permanent scars. Then, flogging, heavier implements that broke blood vessels and bruised deep tissue. Burning came next. Heated metal against flesh until the smell filled the interrogation chamber. The cudgel, a heavy club swung against major muscle groups until bones fractured. And finally, the classic Korean leg-breaking torture. The prisoner's legs placed between heavy wooden planks, then crushed together slowly, deliberately, until bones splintered. Yi Sun-sin endured all of this without confessing. Sources describe him being tortured almost to the point of death. His body was broken, his legs shattered, his flesh burned and torn. But his spirit remained unbroken. King Seonjo wanted him executed. The ministers prepared the death warrant. Then, Minister Jong-tak intervened. Jong-tak argued before the king and court. Regardless of whether Yi had made an error in judgment, his military record was undeniable. 23 battles, 23 victories. No Korean commander in history had achieved such success. Executing him would be seen as betrayal by the people, would damage morale across the military, and would eliminate Korea's greatest naval asset at a time when peace negotiations might collapse at any moment. The arguments were pragmatic, not moral. Jong wasn't defending Yi out of friendship. He was defending Korea's military capabilities. Notably, Yoo Song-ryong said nothing during this debate. Yi's childhood friend, his patron, the man whose support had helped Yi rise through the ranks, Yoo remained silent when Yi needed him most. Perhaps Yoo calculated that defending Yi would cost him his own position. Perhaps he judged that silence was the only way to preserve influence for future intervention. We'll never know his reasoning. But Jong-tak's arguments worked. King Seonjo spared Yi's life. Barely. Instead of execution, Yi was stripped of all rank and title. The supreme commander of naval forces became a common soldier. He was assigned to serve under General Gwon-yul's army. For a Korean general, this demotion was worse than death. Military culture ran on honor and status. Yi had climbed from the lowest ranks to the highest command through decades of service. Now, with broken legs and scarred body, he was forced to start over as an enlisted man at age 52. Yi responded without complaint. No protests, no angry declarations. He simply reported to General Gwon-yul's forces and began serving as ordered. But fate had more cruelty to deliver. During Yi's imprisonment and torture, his mother died. He couldn't attend her funeral. He couldn't perform the traditional mourning rituals expected of a devoted son. His diary from this period records his anguish. "What shall I do? Is there anyone else under heaven in such a pitiful plight as myself? The sooner I die, the better." He had lost his position, his honor, his body's wholeness, and his beloved mother, all within weeks. A lesser man would have broken completely. Yi simply endured. Meanwhile, Won celebrated. The king appointed Won as the new supreme commander of naval forces. The fleet that Yi had built, trained, and led to 23 victories now answered to his incompetent rival. Won took command of 166 warships and 30,000 sailors. The entire Korean navy, carefully assembled and maintained by Yi Sun-sin over years of preparation. The Japanese were preparing their second invasion. Intelligence suggested they would land massive forces in early 1597. Korea's navy had one commander who had never lost a battle, who understood tactics and preparation and discipline at the deepest level. That commander was now a common soldier with broken legs, serving anonymously in a ground army unit. Korea had traded competence for politics. They were about to pay the price. Ashes and resurrection. January 1597. The second Japanese invasion began. Hideyoshi ordered 140,000 fresh troops to Korea, transported by approximately 1,000 ships. The peace negotiations had failed completely. Japan's ambitions hadn't diminished. They had merely been delayed while new forces were assembled. This time, the Japanese were more cautious. They had learned from the first invasion's failures. Supply lines would be protected. Naval support would be coordinated with ground operations, and they would be more careful around Korean naval forces. Won, now commanding the Korean Navy, immediately made strategic errors. Japanese forces landed at Sosong Harbor, a strategic point for supporting the land invasion. Won received intelligence about the landing from his scouts, but Won failed to respond quickly. He allowed the Japanese to secure the beachhead unopposed, disembark their forces, and establish supply routes. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, had he commanded the fleet, would have intercepted the landing force at sea. The Japanese transports would have been vulnerable. A decisive naval attack could have crippled the second invasion before it established momentum. But Yi was busy serving as a common soldier, hauling supplies and following orders from officers far less capable than himself. The Japanese pushed north from their beachheads. They captured fortresses. They advanced toward Seoul. The Joseon army, even with Ming Chinese reinforcements, struggled to contain the invasion. Won grew increasingly desperate to prove himself. The Korean court was questioning his competence. The comparison to Yi's perfect record was obvious and humiliating. Won needed a victory. A dramatic victory that would prove he was the right choice for command. So Won made a catastrophic decision. He would attack the Japanese Navy directly, not with careful reconnaissance, not with strategic positioning, not with Yi's methodical approach of studying the enemy and choosing favorable battlefields. Won would take the entire Korean fleet, all 150 warships, and sail directly to Busan to destroy Japanese naval forces in their main base. His officers urged caution. Some suggested they should wait for better intelligence. Others noted that sailing into waters controlled by the Japanese, where their fleet strength was uncertain, violated basic strategic principles. Won dismissed all objections. He was supreme commander. He would prove his worth through bold action. In late July 1597, Won-gyun's fleet departed from Yosu, sailing east toward Busan. They passed through waters marked by treacherous rocks and strong currents. Won had not scouted these waters adequately. He had not verified enemy fleet positions. He had not prepared contingency plans. On August 28, 1597, the Korean fleet reached the Chilchonryang Strait. What Won found shocked him into paralyzed disbelief. The Japanese had assembled a fleet of between 500 and 1,000 ships. Sources vary on exact numbers, But even the conservative estimates show Won was outnumbered at least 3-1. More importantly, the Japanese had been waiting. They had known the Koreans were coming. They had chosen the battlefield. They had prepared the ambush. Japanese ships emerged from concealed positions among the rocky islands. They closed immediately for melee combat, their preferred tactic. This denied Korean ships the advantage of superior cannon range. Before Won could organize a cohesive response, the Japanese were grappling onto Korean hulls and boarding. The Korean fleet panicked. Won's forces hadn't trained for coordinated defense against boarding actions. They hadn't practiced Yi's formations. The crews, exhausted from the long voyage and shaken by the overwhelming Japanese numbers, collapsed psychologically before they collapsed physically. Japanese samurai poured onto Korean ships. Close-quarters combat erupted across 100 decks simultaneously. The samurai were experts at this type of fighting. Korean sailors were butchered, ships burned, formation disciplines shattered completely. The Battle of Chilchonryang became a massacre. Of the 150 warships in Wongyung's fleet, only 13 survived. 137 ships, destroyed, captured, or sunk. 30,000 Korean sailors and marines, most killed, drowned, or captured. The greatest single naval disaster in Korean history. Wongyung fled. He took a small group of survivors and attempted to reach safety on a nearby island. Japanese forces from a coastal fortress intercepted them. Wongyung and Yi Yokgi, another Korean naval commander, were killed. The Korean Navy had been annihilated. The southern coast now lay completely vulnerable to Japanese attack. Invasion forces could land anywhere without opposition. Supply lines were secure. The path to Seoul was wide open. News of the catastrophe reached King Seonjo's court in early September. The ministers panicked. Some argued that the navy should be disbanded entirely. The remaining 13 ships were useless. Others suggested merging naval forces into the ground army, since naval defense was clearly hopeless. The king summoned his advisors. What could be done? Ryu Seongryong finally spoke. Yi's childhood friend, who had remained silent during Yi's torture and imprisonment, now used his influence. There was one man, Ryu said, who had never lost a naval battle. One man who understood naval warfare better than any commander in Korean history. One man who might, possibly, be able to rebuild something from these ashes. Admiral Yi Sun-sin. The court had tortured him, stripped him of rank, assigned him to serve as a common soldier. His legs were still healing from the breaking torture. He had been humiliated before the entire nation. But he was still alive, and Korea was drowning. King Seonjo issued an emergency pardon. Yi's rank was restored. He was reappointed as Supreme Commander of Naval Forces. Admiral Bae Seol, who had commanded the 13 ships that survived Chilchonryang by fleeing before the battle was fully engaged, brought those vessels to Yi. That was the entire navy. 13 ships and approximately 120 sailors. Before Yi could even reach his new command post, he received a message from King Seonjo. The king suggested that perhaps the navy should be disbanded after all. 13 ships couldn't possibly defend Korea's southern coast. The resources might be better used elsewhere. Yi Sun-sin's response became legendary. He wrote back to the king, "I still have 12 warships left. As long as I am alive, the enemy shall never be safe." September 1597, Admiral Yi Sun-sin arrived at his command post with 13 ships, 120 men, and 0 resources. The Japanese controlled the seas, their fleet numbered in the hundreds. They had momentum, supply superiority, and every strategic advantage. Yi had broken legs, a handful of ships, and an absolutely unbreakable will. He began to rebuild. First, he reached out to survivors from Chilchonryang. Many sailors had escaped to coastal villages or islands. They were in hiding, terrified, believing the war was lost. Yi sent messages. The navy still existed. Commander Yi Sun-sin had returned. Report to duty. Slowly, survivors began to trickle in. By late September, Yi had assembled approximately 1,500 sailors and marines. Not nearly enough for a full fleet, but enough to crew his ships properly. Second, Yi studied the tactical situation obsessively. Where would the Japanese attack next? What were their objectives? How were their forces distributed? He sent scouts in fishing boats to gather intelligence. He questioned refugees. He examined maps and charts constantly. Third, Yi resumed training. Even with his broken-together fleet, even with demoralized crews, even in seemingly hopeless circumstances, Yi drilled his men. Formation practice, cannon timing, signal coordination. Discipline returned slowly. By mid-October 1597, Yi had moved his small fleet to defensive positions near the Myeongnyang Strait. Japanese forces, emboldened by their complete naval dominance, were preparing a massive offensive. They planned to send their fleet up Korea's western coast to support ground forces advancing towards Seoul. The Japanese assembled a fleet in Sachon Bay. Reports varied on exact numbers, but conservative estimates suggested at least 133 warships with significant support vessels, possibly 330 ships total. Against this force, Yi Sun-sin had 13 warships. The odds were approximately 25-1. Some estimates put them even higher. Any reasonable military commander would have retreated. 13 ships couldn't fight over 100. Tactical withdrawal was the obvious choice. Preserve forces for later defensive actions. Live to fight another day. Yi chose to stand and fight, but he chose very carefully where that fight would occur. 13 against 300. October 25th, 1597. September 16th by the lunar calendar. Myeongnyang Strait. Yi Sun-sin studied this place the way a scholar studies ancient texts. Every current, every rock, every geographic feature. The strait separated Jindo Island from the mainland, a narrow passage where water compressed between high walls of stone. The tidal currents through Myeongnyang were notorious. They flowed at approximately 10 knots, faster than most ships could row. But here was the key tactical element. The current reversed direction every 3 hours like clockwork. For 3 hours, water rushed from north to south. Then, gradually, the flow stopped. Then, for 3 hours, water rushed from south to north. Then it stopped and reversed again. This pattern repeated continuously, governed by tidal forces. The strait was also narrow, wide enough for ships to pass, but tight enough that large fleets couldn't deploy in broad formations. Ships would have to enter in columns, limiting their ability to coordinate mass attacks. Finally, the hills surrounding the strait provided shadows and concealment for Yi's small force. This was the perfect battlefield for a vastly outnumbered fleet. Yi positioned his 13 ships on the northern side of the strait, hidden in the shadows of the hillside. He anchored them in defensive formation. Then he waited. Japanese scouts had reported Korean naval activity in the area. The Japanese knew Yi had taken command, but they also knew he had only a handful of ships. What could 13 ships possibly do against their armada? On October 26, the massive Japanese fleet appeared at the southern end of the Myeongnyang Strait. Sources vary on exact numbers. Korean records indicate 133 warships engaged in active combat, with possibly 200 additional support vessels. The true number lies somewhere in that range. What matters is that Yi's force was outnumbered by at least 10-1, possibly as much as 25-1. The Japanese fleet began entering the strait. The current was flowing south to north, in their favor for the approach. Their ships moved swiftly through the narrow passage. Yi's crews watched from their concealed positions. Their hands were steady on the cannons, but their hearts raced with terror. These men had survived Chilchonryang. They had watched 137 ships burn and sink. They had seen 30,000 comrades die. Now, they faced similar odds with only 13 vessels. When the Korean sailors looked at their admiral, they saw calm determination. Yi stood on his flagship's deck studying the approaching Japanese force with the same analytical focus he brought to every battle. Then Yi gave an order that shocked everyone. His flagship would advance alone. The other 12 ships were to hold position and wait for his signal. Yi's ship moved forward to meet the entire Japanese vanguard by itself. Imagine being in Yi's crew at that moment. Your admiral is sailing directly toward over 100 enemy ships. You're alone, completely exposed. The entire Japanese fleet can concentrate fire on you. But Yi had calculated everything precisely. The Japanese vanguard was commanded by Kurushima Michifusa, an experienced naval leader. When Kurushima saw a single Korean ship advancing, he ordered an immediate attack. This was exactly what Yi wanted, to draw Japanese attention and force them to commit to the narrow strait passage. Yi's flagship engaged Kuroshima's ships at medium range. Korean cannons opened fire. The sound rolled across the water like thunder. Shots hammered into Japanese hulls. Return fire from Japanese arquebuses rattled against Yi's ship. For over an hour, Yi's flagship fought alone against the Japanese vanguard. The Korean crew on the other 12 ships watched in amazement and growing courage. If their admiral could face the enemy fleet alone, they could surely fight alongside him. Their paralysis from Chilchon-ryang began to break. Yi had been counting on this psychological effect. Meanwhile, Yi was also counting minutes. The tidal current was about to reverse. The Japanese fleet continued pressing through the strait, confident in their overwhelming numbers. More ships entered the narrow passage. They were bunching together now, packed into the confining geography. Then the current changed. The water flowing north to south died away. For a few minutes, there was relative calm. Then the current began flowing south to north, directly against the Japanese fleet. Ships that had been moving swiftly suddenly found themselves fighting against powerful currents. Maneuverability dropped dramatically. Ships began colliding with each other as their captains struggled to maintain position against the flow. Yi had timed his trap perfectly. Now, he gave the signal. All ships, attack formation. The 12 Korean ships emerged from their concealed positions and advanced rapidly into the strait. Yi's flagship turned and joined the formation. The 13 ships deployed into a defensive line. Anchors dropped to hold position against the current. The Japanese fleet found itself caught in chaos. The narrow strait prevented them from deploying their full numbers. The reversed current made maneuvering almost impossible. Ships collided with each other. Formation discipline collapsed. The Korean ships unleashed devastating, coordinated fire. Yi had drilled his crews for exactly this scenario. Each ship knew its position, its firing arcs, its reload timing. Cannon fire erupted from 13 positions simultaneously, targeting Japanese vessels trapped by the current and geography. Japanese ships attempted to close for boarding, their standard tactic, but the current prevented rapid approach. When vessels did manage to approach Korean ships, they found themselves under concentrated fire from multiple angles. Several Japanese ships attempted to break through the Korean line by brute force. Yi's flagship met them directly, ramming and firing at point-blank range. Kuroshima Michifusa, commanding from one of the lead Japanese vessels, realized his fleet was being systematically destroyed, despite massive numerical superiority. He attempted to reorganize his forces, but the strait's geography and the relentless Korean cannon fire made coordination impossible. During the battle, Kuroshima's ship was heavily damaged. He was killed. Some sources describe him being decapitated and his head mounted on a mast as a warning to other Japanese commanders. The Japanese fleet, unable to bring their numbers to bear effectively, began taking catastrophic casualties. At least 31 warships were destroyed or heavily damaged. Hundreds of Japanese sailors drowned in the powerful currents. Others burned on sinking vessels. Todo Takatora, a Japanese commander who had achieved victory at Chilchon-ryang, was wounded in the engagement. As the battle extended into afternoon, the Japanese began retreating. They abandoned their attempt to break through the strait and withdrew south. Yi ordered a vigorous pursuit, but he was also calculating resources. His 13 ships couldn't chase an enemy fleet indefinitely. He had achieved his objective. The Japanese advance had been stopped. Korean casualties were minimal. 10 killed or wounded, 0 ships lost. Admiral Yi Sun-sin had just achieved, arguably, the greatest naval victory in military history, relative to force disparity. Historians studying the Battle of Myeongnyang compare it to other legendary battles: Thermopylae, Agincourt, Rorke's Drift. But Myeongnyang stands apart because Yi didn't merely survive against impossible odds. He completely defeated his enemy, inflicting devastating casualties while taking almost none himself. Military academies around the world now teach Myeongnyang as a masterclass in defensive tactics, force multiplication through terrain, and the importance of morale and leadership. United States Naval Academy textbooks feature Yi's battle plan. British military historians call it the Nelson touch. A century before Nelson, the Japanese were stunned. Their commanders had expected to sweep the Korean remnant aside easily. Instead, they had lost dozens of ships and been driven back in humiliation. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese naval forces became extremely cautious about engaging Yi's forces, even though they still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. King Sonjo and the royal court received news of the victory with disbelief, followed by jubilation. The minister who had suggested disbanding the navy remained conspicuously silent. Ryu Song-ryong, Yi's friend, reportedly wept when he heard the details. The Battle of Myeongnyang didn't just stop a Japanese offensive. It restored Korean morale across the entire peninsula. It proved that determination and brilliant tactics could overcome impossible odds. It gave hope back to a nation that had nearly given up, and it convinced the Ming Chinese command that the Korean Navy was worth supporting. Admiral Chen Lin, commanding Ming naval forces, had been hesitant to commit ships to what appeared to be a lost cause. After Myeongnyang, Chen recognized that Yi Sun-sin was the real deal, a commander worth fighting alongside. This alliance between Yi and Chen Lin would prove crucial in the war's final chapter. But before that finale, the Japanese had one more cruel revenge to take. They couldn't defeat Yi at sea. So on November 23rd, 1597, Japanese forces conducted a punitive expedition against Yi's home village of Asan. They burned everything. They murdered civilians, and they killed Yi Myon, Admiral Yi's youngest son. Yi recorded the news in his diary with controlled anguish. His youngest boy, dead because the Japanese couldn't touch the father. The entry is brief, dignified, devastating. He had already lost his mother, now his son. Yi continued serving. The final dawn, September 18th, 1598, Fushimi Castle, Japan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died. He was 63 years old, and his grand ambitions had shattered against Korean resistance and Ming intervention. The second invasion had achieved little. Japanese forces controlled only scattered fortress positions along Korea's southern coast. The path to China remained blocked. With Hideyoshi's death, the Council of Five Elders who assumed control of Japan's government ordered immediate withdrawal. The Korean campaign was expensive, demoralizing, and unwinnable. Bring the armies home. But withdrawing wasn't simple. Japanese forces occupied multiple fortified positions, Hwajou fortresses built to withstand siege. These garrisons needed evacuation, but Korean and Ming forces were blocking escape routes. The most problematic position was Suncheon Hwajou, the westernmost Japanese fortress. Konishi Yukinaga commanded 14,000 troops there. Konishi had led Japan's vanguard during the first invasion in 1592. Now, 6 years later, he was trapped. Admiral Yi Sun-sin and Admiral Chen Lin established a naval blockade of Suncheon. No Japanese ships could approach to evacuate Konishi's forces. No supplies could reach the fortress by sea. Konishi was isolated. Konishi tried negotiation. He sent lavish gifts to Chen Lin: gold, silk, valuable items looted from Korea over 6 years of war. The bribe was straightforward. Lift the blockade, allow my forces to leave peacefully, and we'll end this without more bloodshed. Chen Lin initially agreed. From a strategic perspective, allowing the Japanese to evacuate seemed reasonable. The war was effectively over. Why pursue vengeance? Yi Sun-sin refused absolutely. He argued that this was the moment to deliver a crushing blow. The Japanese were attempting to evacuate their entire invasion force. If the Allied fleet could destroy the evacuation fleets, Japan would lose the capability to threaten Korea for generations. The psychological and military impact would secure long-term peace. Allowing the Japanese to withdraw intact meant they could return. Yi knew this. He had studied the enemy for 6 years. Their ambitions wouldn't vanish simply because Hideyoshi died. Only a decisive, devastating defeat would ensure permanent peace. The disagreement between Yi and Chen grew heated. Chen suggested they should attack smaller, more vulnerable Wazhou, like the fortress at Namhae. Yi rejected this strategy as well. It would allow Konishi, commanding one of the largest forces, to escape. Yi's strategic analysis was brilliant. If they destroyed the main evacuation fleets, the smaller garrisons would be forced to surrender or perish. But if they attacked scattered minor targets, the main Japanese forces would withdraw successfully. Chen eventually agreed to maintain the blockade and engage the Japanese evacuation attempt directly. By early December 1598, the situation reached crisis point. Japanese forces at multiple fortresses were preparing coordinated evacuation. On December 15th, approximately 20,000 Japanese troops from the Wazhou of Sachon, Goseong, and Namhae boarded 500 ships and began moving toward the Myeongnyang Strait. Their objective was to link up with Konishi's forces and create a combined fleet strong enough to break the Allied blockade. The commander of this evacuation fleet was Shimazu Yoshihiro, a formidable daimyo who commanded the Sachon fortress. Shimazu's reputation as a warrior was legendary, even by samurai standards. The Allied fleet that would oppose him consisted of 82 Korean Panoxion warships under Admiral Yi, approximately 8,000 Korean sailors and marines, 4 large Ming war junks, probably flagships, 57 lighter Ming war galleys, 2 Panoxion provided to the Ming by Yi, approximately 5,000 Ming sailors from the Guangdong squadron, 2 mighting aboard Korean ships. Total Allied strength, roughly 150 ships and 16,000 men. The Japanese had numerical superiority in total vessels, 500 versus 150. But many of their ships were transports loaded with evacuating troops rather than combat vessels. The Allied fleet had tactical advantages in cannon power and the element of surprise regarding exact Japanese movements. Yi and Chen positioned their fleets at the western end of the Myeongnyang Strait. Intelligence from scouts and local fishermen tracked Japanese movements precisely. Yi knew exactly where Shimazu's fleet would appear and when. The Japanese didn't know the Allied fleet was waiting. December 15th, late night. Yi's fleet split into 2 groups. A small squadron sailed west towards Suncheon to create a diversion. They bombarded Konishi's fortress, as if preparing an all-out assault. Konishi, seeing the attack, burned a signal fire to alert Shimazu that he was under siege and needed relief immediately. Shimazu, seeing the distant flames, made a critical assumption. Yi's fleet had committed to attacking Suncheon, leaving the Myeongnyang Strait undefended. This was his opportunity to break through. The Japanese fleet departed from Sachon Bay and headed toward the Myeongnyang Strait at high speed. What they didn't know was that Yi's main fleet was concealed near the strait, waiting in ambush positions. December 16th, 1598, 2 a.m. The Battle of Myeongnyang began in darkness. The Japanese fleet entered the strait expecting to pass through unopposed. Instead, they sailed directly into concentrated Allied fire. The first indication Shimazu had of the ambush was the flash of cannon fire erupting from multiple positions. Korean and Ming cannons opened up simultaneously. The Allied fleet emerged from concealed positions and moved to surround the Japanese fleet. The strait's geography once again worked in Yi's favor. The narrow passage prevented the Japanese from deploying their full numbers effectively. Like Yi's previous battles, the fight began at range with devastating cannon fire. Japanese ships, designed for boarding combat, couldn't respond effectively to the ranged bombardment. The turtle ships charged into the Japanese formation, their armored hulls absorbing fire while their cannons created havoc. The Japanese attempted to organize counterattacks, but the confusion of the ambush, the darkness, and the relentless Allied fire prevented coordination. Ships collided, formations broke apart. Shimazu's commanders struggled to gain any tactical advantage. As dawn approached, Chen Lin's flagship came under heavy Japanese attack. Several enemy vessels managed to close with the Ming flagship and attempted boarding. Chen's marines fought desperately to repel the assault. Yi immediately ordered his flagship to Chen's rescue. This decision demonstrated Yi's tactical discipline. Personal animosity didn't override battlefield necessity. Chen had disagreed with Yi about strategy, but they were allies in battle. Yi would not allow the Ming commander's flagship to be captured. Yi's flagship fought through multiple Japanese vessels to reach Chen's position. The Korean Marines and cannoneers devastated the Japanese ships attempting to board the Ming flagship. Chen's forces rallied and drove off the remaining attackers. Chen called out to thank Yi for the rescue. Yi's nephew, Yi Wan, responded from the flagship. The actual Admiral Yi Sun-sin could not respond, because at that moment, during the intense fighting around Chen's flagship, a stray arquebus bullet from a Japanese ship had struck Admiral Yi Sun-sin near his left armpit. The bullet penetrated his armor. Sources debate exactly where, but agree it struck high on the left side. The projectile tore through flesh and muscle. Based on medical analysis, it likely pierced the subclavian artery or struck near the heart. Either would be rapidly fatal. Yi knew immediately that the wound was mortal. He looked at his eldest son, Yi Ho, who served aboard the flagship. He looked at his nephew, Yi Wan. The battle raged around them. Ships burned. Men fought and died. The final engagement of a 7-year war hung in the balance. Yi's last words have been preserved by multiple sources, with slight variations, but the meaning is consistent. The war is at its height. Wear my armor and beat my war drums. Do not announce my death. Then, Admiral Yi Sun-sin died. He was 53 years old. He had commanded in at least 23 naval battles. Won all 23. Never lost a ship unnecessarily. Never sacrificed his men carelessly. Never compromised his principles. Only 3 people witnessed his death. Yi Ho, his son, Yi Wan, his nephew, and Song-hui Rip, the flagship's captain. They struggled to process what had just happened. The greatest naval commander in Korean history had just died in the middle of the war's final battle. If the fleet learned their admiral was gone, morale might collapse. The battle might be lost. Everything Yi had fought for might unravel. Yi Ho and Song-hui Rip carried the admiral's body into his cabin, moving quickly to prevent others from seeing. Yi Wan removed his uncle's armor and put it on himself. He took Yi's position on the command deck. He continued beating the war drum in the same rhythm Yi had maintained. From a distance, the Korean and Ming fleets saw Admiral Yi's flagship still in action, still aggressive, still leading the fight. They believed their commander was alive and victorious. Song-hui Rip assumed tactical command of the fleet operations, but he maintained the appearance that Yi remained in charge. Commands were given as if coming from the admiral. The battle continued without pause. The Allied forces, believing Yi still commanded, fought with absolute conviction. The Japanese fleet was systematically destroyed. Ships burned. Shimazu's evacuation fleet suffered catastrophic casualties. Conservative estimates suggest over 200 Japanese vessels were destroyed or captured. Only a fraction of Shimazu's force managed to limp back to Busan harbor. Some sources claim as few as 50 ships survived. Konishi Yukinaga, seeing the battle raging, managed to evacuate his forces through an alternate route by sailing along Namhae Island's southern coast, bypassing the Noryang Strait entirely. He made no attempt to help Shimazu. This cowardice meant crucial Japanese forces escaped, but the strategic situation was irreversible. The Battle of Noryang ended with complete Allied victory. Japanese naval power in Korean waters was permanently shattered. As the fighting died down, Yi Wan continued wearing his uncle's armor, continued maintaining the deception. Chen Lin's ship approached the Korean flagship to coordinate next steps. Chen called out asking to speak with Admiral Yi. Yi Wan finally revealed the truth. Admiral Yi Sun-sin was dead. Chen Lin, according to historical records, collapsed to the deck 3 times, beating his chest and weeping openly. The Ming admiral had disagreed with Yi about strategy, had sometimes found Yi's rigid principles frustrating. But Chen recognized brilliance and integrity when he saw it. News spread through the Allied fleet quickly. Korean sailors wept. Ming forces observed respectful silence, Everyone understood that they had just witnessed the end of an era. Yi's body was transported back to Korea for burial. The 7-year war was effectively over. The Japanese evacuated their remaining forces over the next several weeks. They would not threaten Korea again for centuries. The weight of silence. December 1598. Korea was free. The cost had been staggering. Hundreds of thousands dead, soldiers and civilians, cities burned, farmland destroyed, the economy shattered. Generations would be needed to recover. But Korea remained independent. The Japanese invasion had failed. Ming China, though weakened by the war's cost, had maintained its tributary relationship with Korea. The regional order was preserved, all because one man had refused to accept defeat. The Joseon royal court eventually awarded Yi Sun-sin numerous posthumous honors. They gave him the title Chungmugong, Lord of Loyal Valor. They enrolled him as a Sonmu Ildonggong-sin, first-class merit subject of war. They created monuments and shrines. These honors came easier than the support he had needed while alive. Yi's personal diary, the Nanjung Ilgi, survived him. 7 volumes, written from January 1st, 1592 through November 17th, 1598, just days before his death. The diary covers 205 pages of meticulous daily entries, his strategies, his observations of weather and geography, his personal feelings and struggles. Reading the diary today provides intimate access to Yi's mind, his loneliness, his frustration with incompetent leadership, his deep love for his family, his unwavering commitment to his duty despite constant persecution. The diary was designated National Treasure No. 76 of Korea. In 2013, UNESCO added it to the Memory of the World Registry, recognizing it as invaluable documentary heritage. It remains one of the most important primary source documents from the period. Modern Korea honors Yi's memory extensively. His statue stands at Gwanghwamun Square in central Seoul, holding a sword, watching over the nation he saved. Additional statues stand in Busan, Yosu, and Asan. Shrines preserve his memory. Schools teach his tactics. Films and television dramas retell his story. But Yi's greatest legacy isn't in bronze or stone. It's in the example he set. Military historians worldwide study Yi's campaigns. The United States Naval Academy includes his battles in their curriculum. British naval scholars write analyses of his tactics. Even Japanese military historians, studying their own nation's defeats, acknowledge Yi's genius. After the Russo-Japanese War, Admiral Togo Heihachiro became Japan's greatest naval hero. Foreign press compared him to Britain's Lord Nelson. Togo himself rejected the comparison. It may be proper to compare me to Nelson, but not to Korea's Yi Sun-sin. He is too great to be compared to anyone. That statement, from an enemy commander, speaks volumes about Yi's reputation. Legacy of the undefeated. What makes a hero? Courage? Yi had that. Facing impossible odds repeatedly and never backing down. Brilliance? Yi's tactical innovations revolutionized naval warfare, the turtle ships, the crane wing formation, his use of geography and tides as force multipliers. Victory? 23 battles, 23 wins, an undefeated record that remains unmatched in naval history. But those qualities alone don't explain Yi Sun-sin's enduring significance. Plenty of generals won battles. Some maintained impressive records. Others introduced tactical innovations. Yi's true greatness lay in something harder to quantify: integrity. He fought 2 enemies simultaneously. The Japanese Navy tried to kill him in battle. His own government tried to destroy him through politics. The Japanese failed every time. His own government nearly succeeded, yet Yi never compromised his principles. He refused to follow orders he knew were based on false intelligence, even though it meant torture and imprisonment. He refused to take bribes or engage in corruption, even though it made him enemies. He gave credit to subordinates for victories and took responsibility for any problems. When the king wanted to disband the navy, when only 12 ships remained, when any reasonable person would have admitted defeat, Yi chose to stand. His letter to the king captures this perfectly. "I still have 12 warships left. As long as I am alive, the enemy shall never be safe. Not, we might survive. Not, I'll do my best. But absolute certainty that he would prevail, because his will was unbreakable." That's the heart of Yi's legacy. Not just tactical genius or personal courage, but the demonstration that one determined individual, committed to principles and excellence, can change the course of history. The turtle ships exemplify this philosophy. Yi didn't invent the concept. Earlier designs existed from centuries before, but Yi improved them, built them, deployed them, and proved their effectiveness. He took an idea that others had abandoned and turned it into the weapon that saved his nation. Every innovation in the turtle ship's design served practical purposes. The armored deck prevented boarding, the Japanese Navy's primary tactic. The multiple cannon ports provided all-around firepower. The dragon head emitted smoke to obscure movements and terrorize enemies. Even the iron spikes served dual purposes: anti-boarding defense and psychological warfare. Yi thought about every detail. How to keep crews safe while maintaining offensive capability. How to maximize firepower in limited space. How to create psychological impact alongside physical destruction. The turtle ships weren't just engineering achievements. They were integrated weapons systems designed by a commander who understood both technology and human psychology. The crane wing formation demonstrated Yi's grasp of coordinated tactics. On land, this formation was ancient and well known. At sea, where ships moved independently with winds, currents, and waves affecting each vessel differently, the formation was nearly impossible to execute. Yi made it possible through drilling, endless practice. His crews learned to maintain spacing and positioning regardless of environmental conditions. They practiced coordinated turns, synchronized firing patterns, and communication under combat stress. At Hansando, when Yi's 5-ship squadron lured the Japanese fleet into open water, and the Korean forces deployed into crane wing formation, that moment wasn't luck or inspiration. It was the product of months of systematic training, paying off in perfect execution. Yi's understanding of geography and environmental factors gave him advantages that compensated for numerical inferiority. At Myeongnyang, he didn't simply fight in a strait. He specifically chose that strait because he had studied its tidal patterns for weeks. He knew the current reversed every 3 hours. He knew the timing. He knew he could use that reversal to trap the Japanese fleet. This level of preparation separated Yi from good commanders. Good commanders react to opportunities. Great commanders create opportunities through superior knowledge and preparation. But preparation and tactical brilliance don't fully explain why Yi's legacy resonates so powerfully in Korea and beyond. The deeper reason lies in his character, specifically his response to betrayal and injustice. When Yi was arrested in 1597, tortured, and demoted to common soldier, he had every reason to refuse further service. The government had destroyed him. The king wanted him dead. His own military rivals had conspired against him. His childhood friend, Yu Seong-ryong, had remained silent when Yi needed support most. Any reasonable person would have felt entitled to resignation, to letting those who persecuted him face the consequences of their decisions. Yi could have walked away. History would have understood. Instead, Yi reported for duty as a common soldier without complaint. He served under General Gwon Yul with the same dedication he had shown as supreme commander. When the fleet was destroyed at Chilchonryang, when the king wanted to disband the navy, when only 12 ships remained, Yi didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't demand apologies. He simply took command of those 12 ships and got back to work. This response to injustice defines true heroism. Not revenge, not bitterness, not even demanding acknowledgement of being right. Just quiet, determined continuation of duty, regardless of recognition or reward. Yi's diary entries during his imprisonment and demotion reveal his pain. He questioned whether life was worth continuing. He grieved his mother's death. He felt the humiliation of being stripped of rank. But these feelings never translated into abandoning his principles or his country. That's why Koreans today, more than 4 centuries after Yi's death, still look to him as a moral exemplar. Modern Korea faces different challenges than the Japanese invasions, but the underlying questions remain the same. How do you maintain integrity when systems are corrupt? How do you persist when surrounded by incompetence? How do you keep serving when betrayed by those you served? Yi's example provides answers, not through abstract philosophy but through lived demonstration. He also represents something universal, the possibility of excellence in the face of systemic failure. The Joseon court was dysfunctional. King Seonjo was weak and paranoid. Officials prioritized personal advancement over national defense. Won-gyun's appointment to Supreme Naval Command represented everything wrong with nepotistic, political-driven military organization. Yet despite operating within this broken system, Yi succeeded. He couldn't change the system. His attempts to maintain standards and resist corruption only created enemies. But he could control his own actions, his own unit, his own standards. By maintaining excellence in his sphere of responsibility, he created an island of competence in a sea of dysfunction. This resonates in any era. People everywhere face systems that frustrate them, bureaucracies that reward politics over competence, leadership that prioritizes optics over substance. Yi demonstrates that individual excellence still matters, still makes a difference, still changes outcomes even when surrounded by systemic failure. The turtle ships serve as a perfect metaphor for this principle. The ships had protective armor. Yi had to protect his forces and his principles from external attack. But the ships also had powerful offensive weapons. Yi didn't just defend passively. He attacked problems directly with force and innovation, and the ships operated within the system. They worked alongside conventional Panoxion warships, integrated with the broader fleet, rather than trying to operate independently. Yi's approach wasn't revolutionary in the sense of overthrowing the system. It was revolutionary in achieving extraordinary results while operating within the constraints the system imposed. Modern naval warfare still reflects concepts Yi pioneered. The idea of armored warships protecting crews from small arms fire while delivering devastating ranged firepower. This became standard with ironclads, and eventually modern destroyers and cruisers. The emphasis on crew safety, systematic training, and coordinated tactics became foundational to naval doctrine worldwide. The crane wing formations principles, surrounding enemies with coordinated fire from multiple angles, evolved into modern naval battle group tactics. The specific formation changed, but the underlying concept of creating overlapping fields of fire that prevent enemy maneuver remains central to naval strategy. Yi's emphasis on intelligence gathering, terrain environmental exploitation, and psychological warfare predated modern joint operations doctrine by centuries. He understood that winning battles required more than firepower. It required information superiority, tactical positioning, and breaking enemy morale. The Admiral Who Stood Alone. December 16, 1598. Dawn breaking over the Noryang Strait. The battle is won. Japanese ships burn on the horizon. Korean and Ming forces are securing their victory. In the Admiral's cabin aboard his flagship, Yi Sun-sin's body lies still. 53 years, 23 victories, 0 defeats. His last words, echo across the water, carried by the wind, transmitted through centuries. The war is at its height. Do not announce my death. Even dying, Yi's focus remained on the mission. Not on glory or recognition, not on legacy or historical reputation, on the immediate tactical necessity. Keep the fleet fighting until victory is secured. This was always Yi's way. Duty before self, country before comfort, principles before politics, victory before vanity. They would build statues of him, write histories about him, tell his story to children as an example of heroism. But Yi never sought these honors. He sought only to serve well, to fight honestly, to protect his country effectively. In his final moments, he achieved that purpose absolutely. The war ended in Korean victory. The invasion was repelled. His people were safe. Nothing else mattered. The admiral who had stood alone against corruption, against impossible odds, against his own government's betrayal, that admiral died as he lived, focused on duty, committed to excellence, undefeated. His sword is now silent, but his example rings across time like his war drums once rang across Korean waters. The sound speaks to anyone who faces overwhelming obstacles, to anyone who struggles against systems that reward mediocrity, to anyone who wonders whether integrity matters in a compromised world. Yi Sun-sin's answer is carved in history. It matters absolutely. One person of absolute commitment and competence can change the world, can save nations, can defeat impossible odds, not through superhuman abilities, not through perfect circumstances, but through unbreakable determination, meticulous preparation, brilliant innovation, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. The Japanese came with 160,000 troops and 1,700 ships. They had conquered most of East Asia. They had unified Japan through decades of civil war. They had every advantage. They were stopped by an admiral with 13 ships and an unbreakable will. This is Yi Sun-sin's legacy, not just the battles he won, but the example he set. Not just the turtle ships he built, but the principles he embodied. Not just the nation he saved, but the demonstration that excellence and integrity can triumph over any obstacle. 4 centuries later, his statue stands in Seoul's Gwanghwamun Square. He holds his sword, watches the city he saved, guards the people he protected. Tourists take photos. Children learn his story. Military officers study his tactics. But the real monument isn't bronze or stone. It's in every person who chooses excellence over mediocrity, every leader who refuses to compromise principles for politics, every individual who stands firm when surrounded by corruption. Every time someone faces impossible odds and decides to fight anyway. That's Yi Sun-sin's monument. That's his victory. That's his undefeated record continuing into the present. The admiral who stood alone is never truly alone. His example stands with everyone who chooses to serve with honor, to fight with integrity, to lead with excellence regardless of recognition or reward. A final word. These are not just stories from distant history. They are mirrors showing us who we can become. Yi Sun-sin faced the same human challenges we all face: betrayal, injustice, overwhelming odds, personal loss. He responded with courage, integrity, and absolute commitment to purpose. His life proves that circumstances don't determine outcomes. Character does. Preparation does. Principles do. If this story moved you, honor the courage it represents. Support those who share these stories, who remind us that excellence is possible, that integrity matters, that one person can make a difference. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. These actions might seem small, but they're how we keep legends alive, how we ensure that stories of true heroism continue inspiring future generations. Because somewhere, right now, someone faces their own impossible battle, their own moment of betrayal, their own test of character. They need to know that people like Yi Sun-sin existed, that people can face torture and imprisonment and still choose honor, can face 13 ships against 300 and still choose to fight, can die on the deck of their ship, still focused on mission rather than self. That's the power of these stories. That's why they matter. That's why we remember. Admiral Yi Sun-sin died on December 16, 1598, but his example lives forever. Because legends never die. They transform into inspiration that echoes across centuries, waiting to ignite courage in whoever needs it most. Stand with us, support the channel, and remember, the next impossible victory is waiting for someone brave enough to attempt it.